Vladimir Putin is surrounding himself with adoring crowds, claiming he has public support after the mutiny by Wagner mercenary forces. CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh is in Ukraine for us tonight. He's covering all the new developments. Nick, first of all, what message is Putin sending with this latest appearance?
I think it's a pretty cheap bid to replicate the scenes, frankly, we saw in Rostov on Saturday, where Yevgeny Prigozhin, the insurrection leader, had people not mobbing, but coming up close and embracing his hand through the window of an SUV. Here is Putin in Derbent in Dagestan, an area where we saw protests against some of the mobilization that we saw last year, with a crowd that looks frankly pretty staged, very adoring, very close to him. Not the Putin who kept everyone at a distance during the pandemic and for quite a while after it. But it comes after a day in which more reporting is emerging, suggesting the splits and dangers from his own military top brass. I spoke to a European intelligence official who said it was possible that there had been prior knowledge amongst the Russian military and security establishment of this insurrection. He said they'd heard of hints to that effect, and that possibly some of those people had in fact wanted to see how it played out or even see it succeed, and that Putin's prestige had been damaged, and that may well have been what these differing factions in the Moscow elite had indeed sought. So a lot suggesting here that Putin's been deeply shaken in terms of his authority, despite the images they're projecting from Dagestan of him with adoring crowds, Wolf.
Yeah, and Nick, it's interesting that this failed mutiny is almost certainly going to increase Putin's paranoia. So what does that mean for his inner circle?
A pretty paranoid man, going to go yet further still, absolutely. And we heard some reporting from the New York Times today suggesting that Sergei Surovikin, who was until recently the commander of the Ukraine invasion, that he had, according to US intelligence assessments, potentially had prior knowledge of the Prigozhin insurrection. Now, there's no evidence publicly available to back that up, and indeed some that we know publicly contradict it. He did appear on television on Friday telling people to stand down, to not go along with the Prigozhin rebellion, and indeed the Air Force, which he now commands, were involved in trying to slow Wagner's movements towards Moscow. But still, as far as we're aware, he hasn't been seen in public since the deal was struck between Prigozhin, the president of Belarus, and Putin. And that's led many to think there may be a lot of scrutiny within the Moscow elite, the top brass, and possibly Putin trying to re-establish authority, or in this very divided, very fraught, at times kleptocratic and frankly lethal inner circle that he's created after 23 years in power, bids people to try and outwit each other, outdo each other, profit from the situation indeed. And so that is going to make people in Kiev here, frankly, fighting Russia in the war, deeply happy at the possibility of yet more division within the Russian top brass. And I think we may begin to see more details in the days and weeks ahead as exactly how this likely bitter power struggle of anxiety, as they try and assess how this extraordinary threat to Putin occurred, play out in some quite bitter divisions and maybe even repercussions. Wolf.
Yeah, I'm sure we will be learning a lot more. Nick Payton-Walsh, thank you very much for that report. Let's discuss what's going on right now with a veteran of the U.S. National Security Council with a lot of expertise on both Russia and Ukraine. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman is joining us. He's in Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, right now. Alex, thanks so much for joining us. What does it say that the Kremlin put out this video of Putin surrounded by admirers just a few days after we saw Russians cheering the Wagner chief after his failed mutiny?
Thanks, Will, for having me on. It's pretty surreal. You don't see Putin out in public. We haven't seen him in quite some time. He's certainly, with regards to COVID, he was very, very insular. He kept folks, even his inner circle, at arm's length. Everybody remembers those tables. He sat, kind of like a football field away from his closest advisors. So he doesn't go out publicly. This is certainly a response to what seemed like popular support for Prigozhin in Rostov. And Putin is in a way trying to fake it till he makes it. Fake it until he really kind of feels more comfortable in his own position, demonstrate to his own inner circle that he actually is in charge, and convince them that he's still in charge. So I think this is a completely kind of a show, and Putin trying to kind of recreate a narrative that he's in charge.
How do you expect Putin may try to consolidate control right now in the aftermath of this truly unprecedented threat that he dealt with?
I think there are ghosts in the shadows for him, and he's keenly aware that what he thought was a tight inner circle, folks that he didn't really need to worry about, folks that he basically developed and kept in place mainly for loyalty, even if their competence is questionable, may not be as loyal as he thinks. And in this case, he frankly is totally responsible for this insurrection, near coup attempt, because he was aware of the infighting between Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense for months. He could have put a stop to it. He let it kind of boil over because he thought that it could be useful initially as a foil to put pressure on the Ministry of Defense to do more, to be more effective in this war. He doesn't have a firm control over his own elites that he's nurtured, developed for a long time. And he's in a lot of ways, he needs to demonstrate that to himself, to the elites, and frankly around the world, some strength. So we could see him lashing out in different kinds of ways to demonstrate that he's still the strongman that he pretended to be before this war.
Yeah, good
started.
point. The Ukrainian President Zelensky today acknowledged that the Wagner forces, at least some of them, Wagner forces, are still in Ukraine. Watch and listen to this.
The Wagnerites are present on the temporary occupied territory of Ukraine. They are and they were present in the Luhansk region. This is truth. A lot of them were eliminated by our defense forces. Over 20,000 of them were eliminated.
So, Alex, to what extent will those Wagner mercenaries actually factor into the ongoing fight?
I think they're a huge headache for the Russian armed forces. They're not trusted, so they can't be put back into the fight. They're still heavily armed, and they're still in a vulnerable position. Nobody on the Russian side and the leadership wants those folks back on the road to Rostov or heading towards Moscow. So a portion of the force that should be fighting for to seize Ukraine for Putin's objectives is now policing Wagner. That is a reserve element that was intended likely to be a plug holes when the Ukrainians break through. There's still a lot of unknowns. I think from my perspective, the biggest lesson learned is that Putin's regime is brittle, and Ukraine is likely to win this war. The question is, what does the U.S. do to aid this fight? And in just about 10 days, and there will be a NATO summit. My hope is national security analysis suggests that the U.S. should seize this moment to make a strong overture for Ukraine to join NATO. That could be an affirmative approach that could be lasting and bring security to the region, certainly after this war is done, but even as this war kind of starts to wind down towards the end of this year after your successful Ukraine offensive, this would be a huge step forward that the U.S. should be pushing for.
Well, let's see if that happens. Certainly President Zelensky would welcome that decision. Alexander Vindman, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.